Ease. You think I didn't see it? I saw everything. I just couldn't say it fast enough. Emily Carter was 20 years old. Ease. Deaf since birth and running barefoot through the Arizona desert when she made the decision that would split her life clean in two before. Ease. And after. She had no phone signal, no voice, no way to stop what was coming, except her own two legs and the desperate prayer that someone at that clubhouse would look at a bleeding. Ease. Breathless girl long enough to read what she was writing. Ease. 5 armed men, 2 miles behind her, and a clock ticking down to a massacre she was the only person alive who knew about. Ease. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please subscribe to our channel and follow Emily's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The diner where Emily Carter worked was called Pauline's, and it sat on the southeastern edge of Red Hollow, Arizona, the kind of place that existed mostly to give long-haul truckers somewhere to put their coffee cups and their loneliness. Emily had worked the afternoon shift there for 11 months, clearing tables and refilling ketchup bottles and communicating with her regulars through a laminated card. She'd made herself a grid of common phrases printed in bold letters that she could point to when someone's eyes glazed over, trying to read her signs. Need a refill? Ready to order? Have a great day. She had learned a long time ago to make things easy for people who didn't want to be inconvenienced by her existence. Her manager, a heavyset man named Doug Perkins, had hired her on a trial basis with the barely concealed skepticism of someone doing what he considered a charitable act. He spoke to her loudly and with exaggerated mouth movements, as though volume might somehow reverse what had been with her from birth. When the diner got busy, he'd forget she couldn't hear him and bark instructions from across the room. Then get annoyed when she didn't respond. After 11 months, he still wrote her schedule on a Post-it note and slid it across the counter without looking at her, like she might be contagious. Emily endured it. She needed the paycheck, and Red Hollow wasn't exactly overflowing, with employers eager to accommodate a deaf 20-year-old with no college degree and a 2-bedroom house she shared with a grandmother whose arthritis was getting worse every winter. Her grandmother, Nora, was the only person in Emily's life who had never once made her feel like a burden. Nora had learned basic ASL from library books when Emily was 4 years old, staying up late at the kitchen table with a flashlight and a notebook, drilling herself on hand shapes until she could hold a real conversation with her granddaughter. It was Nora who had told Emily more times than Emily could count, that the world would try to make her feel small, and that the most powerful thing she could ever do was refuse. Emily thought about that a lot on the afternoon of July 17th. She had clocked out at 4:30 and started the walk home. The same 2-mile route she took every shift, cutting behind the old grain processing plant on Durango Road and then angling southeast along a stretch of packed dirt that eventually connected back to Highway 9. It was a shortcut that shaved 8 minutes off the walk. She'd been taking it for months. The heat was still brutal at that hour. The kind of dry, pressing Arizona heat that made the inside of your nose feel like sandpaper. Emily had her earbuds in out of habit. She wore them because she'd discovered early in life that people were less likely to try to talk to her if they assumed she was listening to something. And it saved her the awkward theater of explaining her deafness to strangers who always looked at her like she'd told them she had a terminal illness. She was thinking about dinner. She was thinking about whether Nora had remembered to take her afternoon medication. She was thinking about the electric bill that was due on Friday and whether she'd have enough after groceries. She was not thinking about the abandoned Kellner warehouse. The Kellner warehouse had been empty for 6 years. Ever since the company that owned it went bankrupt and the town's one attempt at light manufacturing quietly collapsed. The building sat about 40 yards off the dirt path, behind a rusted chain-link fence that had been bent back in 3 different places by years of kids, teenagers and drifters using it as a shortcut. Emily had walked past it hundreds of times. It had always been empty and quiet and forgettable. Today, there were 2 vehicles parked on the far side of it that she didn't recognize. One was a dark blue panel van with no markings, the kind that rental companies kept in their lots and contractors drove. The other was a black pickup truck with a Tucson County plate and a dent in the rear quarter panel that someone had tried and failed to hammer out. Emily noticed the vehicles because she was bored and because she noticed things. That was one of the compensations the universe had apparently decided to offer in exchange for taking her hearing. She paid attention. She read faces. Body language. The tension in someone's shoulders. The way a person's eyes moved when they were lying or afraid. She had developed over 20 years of navigating a world not built for her. A sensitivity to the details that most people walked right past. So she noticed the vehicles, and because she noticed the vehicles, she noticed the men. There were 5 of them. They were gathered on the south side of the warehouse, partly obscured by the angle of the building, which was why she could see them, but they hadn't clocked her yet. She slowed without thinking, the instinct of a person who had learned that sudden movements draw attention. She kept her pace steady and turned her head just enough to use her peripheral vision. The way she might glance at a stranger she was trying not to stare at. The first thing she registered was the guns, not concealed, not holstered, but laid out 2 of them on the hood of the pickup truck, being checked and loaded with the past businesslike efficiency of people who had done this before. One of the men had a tactical vest on. Another was unfolding a paper. She couldn't see what it was from this distance. But the way the other men crowded around it suggested a map, or a diagram, or a plan. The second thing she registered was the direction they kept looking. Every few seconds, one of them would glance north, specifically northeast, specifically toward the low flat-roofed building about 1.5 miles away where, every Friday afternoon without fail, the motorcycles gathered. She'd seen them herself 100 times, the long rumbling procession, the leather and chrome, the sound she couldn't hear, but could feel vibrating up through the soles of her shoes when she stood on the pavement near enough. The Hells Angels clubhouse. Emily did not stop walking. She kept her pace even, and her face forward, and she walked until she was past the fence line and the angle of the warehouse blocked her from their sight. And then she stopped and stood completely still in the middle of the dirt path and tried to process what she'd just seen. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that with the detached clarity of someone whose body has understood something faster than her mind has caught up. She pulled out her phone. No signal. Red Hollow's cell coverage was patchy on a good day. And this part of the route was a dead zone she'd long since accepted as the cost of the shortcut. She held the phone up, turned in a slow circle, watched the signal indicator stay stubbornly at 0. She looked back in the direction she'd come from. Pauline's diner was almost 1 mile behind her. Doug Perkins would be annoyed if she came back. He'd already locked up the back office. And she'd have to knock on the front window and explain herself. Which meant writing everything out, which meant time. Which meant she looked ahead. The Hells Angels clubhouse was 1.5 miles in the other direction. She looked back at the warehouse. She couldn't see the men from where she was standing. But she knew they were there. She knew what she'd seen. 5 men with weapons, watching a building full of people who had no idea what was parked 2 minutes away from them. Her grandmother's voice came to her, as clearly as it ever could in a mind that had never known sound. The most powerful thing you can ever do is refuse to be small. Emily put her phone in her pocket and she ran. She had run track for 2 years in high school. Before the combination of transportation logistics and a coach who communicated exclusively through a whistle made the whole enterprise more trouble than it was worth. She wasn't fast, but she was stubborn, and she knew how to breathe through pain and keep her stride even when her lungs started burning. The dirt path was loose and uneven, full of the small rocks and ridges that southern Arizona passed off as ground. She caught her left foot on something at the quarter-mile mark and went down hard. Both palms scraping the earth, one knee connecting with a rock that sent a white streak of pain up through her hip. She was back on her feet in under 3 seconds. She didn't look back. Her mind was doing the thing it did sometimes when she was frightened. Ease, when it became very clear, like a pool that stops moving. Ease. She was thinking about the men at the warehouse. She was thinking about how long it had taken her to walk from the diner to the warehouse 11 minutes. Ease. If those men were planning to move soon, if they were waiting for the clubhouse to reach peak capacity B, she ran faster. Ease. The sweat was soaking through her shirt by the half-mile mark. Ease. The sun was hitting her at a low angle, right in the eyes. Ease. And she squinted against it and kept going. She passed the old water tower. Ease. The one with the faded red letters that had been peeling for as long as anyone could remember. Ease. She passed the broken gate at the edge of the Hendricks property. Ease. She counted landmarks because counting made time feel like something she was eating through instead of something that was running out. Ease. She had a pen in her apron pocket. She always kept a pen. Ease. And she had a small spiral notebook in her bag. She carried it everywhere. Ease. The same way some people carry a phone charger, the same way other people carry anxiety. Ease. It was how she talked to the world that didn't know ASL. Ease. She was going to need both of them in about 60 seconds. Ease. The clubhouse came into view, a long, low building with a gravel parking lot that held more motorcycles than she could quickly count. Ease. All of them parked with the kind of deliberate order that said these were people who took pride in what they owned. Ease. There were a handful of trucks and SUVs along the edge. Ease. The building itself was solid and unremarkable, the kind of structure that told you nothing from the outside. Ease. Emily slowed at the edge of the parking lot, suddenly. Ease. Viscerally aware of what she was about to do. She was a 20-year-old woman. Ease alone, not from their world. Ease covered in dust and bleeding from her palms. Ease about to walk into a building full of people with a reputation that had made grown men reconsider their evening plans. Ease. She thought about the guns on the hood of that pickup truck. Ease. She opened the door. The wave of sensation hit her immediately. She couldn't hear it. Ease. But she could feel it. The vibration of conversation and laughter and music moving through the floor and up into her legs, through her chest, like standing too close to a speaker. Ease. The room smelled like beer and leather and something mechanical underneath. Ease, like oil and metal. It was crowded. There were maybe 40. Ease. 50 people she could see from where she stood, men mostly. Ease. Big men. Men who had the look of people who had lived hard and made their own rules and didn't particularly apologize for either. Ease. Every head in the room turned toward her. She stood in the doorway. Ease. Chest heaving, sweat running down her face, her hands still bleeding from the fall. Ease. She knew she looked insane. She knew how this appeared from the outside, some random girl bursting into a biker clubhouse looking like she'd crawled through the desert. Ease, which she essentially had. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely open her notebook. Ease. A man near the front stood up from his bar stool. He was big, not just tall, but wide through the shoulders. Ease. The kind of build that came from actual physical work and not a gym. Ease. He had gray eyes and the kind of face that had been lived in. Ease. Creased and certain. His vest had more patches than she could read quickly. Ease. But she caught the words road captain, and below that the name everyone in 3 counties knew. Bear. His name was Jackson Holloway, but nobody called him that. Ease. He took one look at her and held up a hand, not to stop her, but to stop the 3 other men who had started moving in her direction. Ease. Emily was already writing. Her handwriting was terrible. She was shaking too badly to do better, but she pressed hard and made every letter as clear as she could manage, and when she had it, she tore the page out and held it up with both hands. Ease. High enough that the people at the back of the room could see she was trying to show something. Ease. Not attack anyone. Bear read it. His expression didn't change. Ease. Not at first. Not the way you might expect someone's expression to change. Ease. He was very still. Then he took the paper from her hands. Everyone shut up, he said. She couldn't hear him say it. Ease. But she saw the room respond. The vibrations changed. Ease. The faces turned. The laughter stopped. He held the paper up so the men nearest to him could read it. Ease. Then he looked at Emily. Show me. He pointed at the paper. Ease. Then at her. Then at the door. She understood. She nodded. Ease. He came around the bar without another word, and she turned and pushed back out through the door. Ease. And he followed her into the Arizona heat, and she started pointing. Ease. His name was Bear, and in 31 years of riding, Ease. Bear Holloway had developed what he privately called his read the ability, ease, honed through years of watching people to determine within the first 20 seconds of an interaction whether someone was telling the truth. Ease. It wasn't infallible. Ease. Nothing was. Ease. But it was reliable enough that he had come to trust it the way he trusted his bike. Ease. The way he trusted his oldest brothers. He read the girl in the first 5 seconds. She wasn't performing. She wasn't angled. There was no calculation in her face. No backward glance to see how her story was landing. What she had was terror so genuine and so focused that it had burned off everything else. She was still breathing hard from running. Her hands were torn up from a fall. And the look in her eyes when she'd held up that paper wasn't the look of someone asking for something. It was the look of someone who had already given everything they had and were praying it was enough. She pointed southeast toward the warehouse district. She pulled out her notebook again, already writing before she'd finished turning around. 5 men, armed 2 guns I saw on a truck. They were looking at map. He's looking at this building. Bear read it. He read it again. How far? He asked, making sure to face her when he spoke. She held up 2 fingers, then pointed at the ground. 2 miles. How long ago? She thought for a moment. Then wrote, maybe 20 minutes. I ran the whole way. Bear looked at her bleeding palms. He looked at her shoes. Which were not running shoes. He looked at the sweat that had soaked through her shirt completely. He thought about a 20-year-old girl running 2 miles through Arizona heat in work shoes on a dirt path to warn strangers who had never done a single thing for her. He turned and went back inside. What happened in the next 4 minutes was something Emily would replay for years. Not because she had expected it, but because she had spent so long being ignored that she had genuinely stopped expecting anything else. Bear walked back in and spoke to 3 men. Those 3 men moved immediately. Without discussion, with the fluid coordination of people who trusted each other completely and understood that time was a factor. One of them got on a phone, a satellite phone, she realized. Not a cell. One of them moved toward the back of the building. The third went to the door and stepped outside to position himself where he could see the parking lot. Then Bear came back to where she was standing, just inside the entrance, and he looked at her directly. I believe you, he said. Slow, clear, making sure she could read his lips. You understand me. I believe you. She had not been prepared for that. She had prepared herself for skepticism. She had prepared herself for the version of this conversation where they looked at each other uncertainly and then someone said, maybe we should call someone, in a tone that meant, we don't know what to do with you. She had prepared herself to have to fight for every sentence to be taken seriously. The way she always had to fight. She had not prepared herself for the immediate, uncomplicated weight of being believed. Her eyes went wet before she could stop them. She turned her face, slightly embarrassed by it. Bear noticed. He didn't make a big thing of it. He just said, you did good. You did real good. And then he pulled out his own phone and started working. Within 12 minutes of Emily walking through that door. The clubhouse had transformed. People she hadn't even noticed were suddenly in different positions. 2 men she'd taken for casual drinkers had stood up from a corner table and moved to windows. And she realized their previous posture had been practiced and intentional. The posture of people trained to look relaxed while paying attention to everything. A woman behind the bar, solidly built, in her 40s, with the focused efficiency of someone who had seen emergencies before, was coordinating something on a tablet, pulling up what looked like a satellite map. Emily stood near the wall and tried to stay out of the way and process what was happening. A man with a shaved head and a beard that had gone mostly gray came and stood next to her. He was younger than Bear by maybe a decade, and he had the particular stillness of someone who was very good at something dangerous. He looked at her hands and then disappeared for 2 minutes and came back with a first aid kit and a bottle of water. He didn't ask permission, he just held out the water first. Waited until she'd drunk half of it and then opened the kit and started cleaning her palms with the matter-of-fact competence of someone who'd cleaned up worse. She watched his hands while he worked. He had a tattoo across the back of his right hand that she couldn't fully read at this angle. She looked up at his face. He was already looking at her. He held up a finger one moment and then pointed at himself. Rook, he said, tapping his chest. Then he pointed at her with a questioning look. She reached for her notebook, but he shook his head and pointed at her chest again. Eyebrows up, your name. She spelled it out. Emily. Finger spelled, which he clearly didn't know. So she followed it up by writing it on a page and showing him. He nodded, Emily. He said it back to her, not the exaggerated way some people did. Just straightforwardly, the word landing between them without ceremony. She thought, this is a strange place to feel comfortable. And then she thought, but here we are. The Yavapai County Sheriff's Department received the call at 4:57 p.m. The tip came from Jackson Holloway directly. And the responding sergeant, a 22-year veteran named Pete Calloway, who had a complicated relationship with the Angels chapter that boiled down to mutual respect and mutual wariness, took it seriously because Bear Holloway had never in. 31 years, called in something that turned out to be nothing. What the deputies found at the Kellner warehouse was not nothing. 2 vehicles. 5 occupants. A quantity of weapons that exceeded anything that could plausibly be attributed to recreational use. And a handwritten diagram of the Hells Angels clubhouse that included notations in the margins that Sheriff Calloway later described, carefully, as operational planning material. 3 of the 5 men had outstanding warrants in other states. The 4th was on a federal watch list. The 5th, the one who'd been wearing the tactical vest, had a phone that law enforcement would spend the next 3 weeks working through. They had been 40 minutes away from moving. Emily learned all of this in pieces, over the days that followed. She learned it through conversations that were sometimes written out for her and sometimes relayed through a woman named Carla Bear's wife. It turned out, a small, fierce woman with reading glasses she wore, pushed up on her head, and a directness that Emily found immediately comfortable, who had, it emerged, a neighbor with a deaf child, and had picked up enough ASL to manage real conversation. She learned it. And she sat with it. And she tried to understand what it meant that she had been the only person in the right place at the right moment. And that she had run. You know what most people would have done? Carla said one afternoon. 5 days after the incident, the 2 of them sitting at a kitchen table with cups of coffee between them. Carla signed as she spoke. The ASL imperfect but earnest and good enough. Most people would have told themselves it wasn't their problem. Would have kept walking. Emily shook her head. I couldn't do that. I know, Carla said. That's the whole thing. That's exactly the whole thing. What none of them had talked about, yet what Emily had been quietly, carefully not mentioning, was the part of the story that came after the arrest. The part where the men who'd been taken into custody started talking. And what they said changed everything. Because the weapons and the diagram and the operational planning material, that was bad enough. But what emerged from the interviews, slowly and then all at once, was that this hadn't been a spontaneous decision. This had been organized. Funded. Directed by someone who had a reason to want the Hells Angels chapter in Red Hollow specifically disrupted. Not just attacked, disrupted. Their leadership compromised. Their community fractured. And the person who'd organized it had already figured out that something went wrong. And they had already started asking questions about how. Emily didn't know any of this yet when she walked home on the evening of July 22nd, 5 days after the run that had changed everything. She was tired and oddly peaceful, the way you feel after surviving something and finally letting yourself exhale. She was 3 blocks from her grandmother's house when the black pickup truck pulled up beside her and rolled to a stop. The window came down. The man behind the wheel was someone she had never seen before. He was thin, probably mid-40s, with the kind of face that gave nothing away. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he said something. She couldn't hear him, obviously. But she could read his lips well enough to catch the last 2 words of what he said. Wrong choice. And then the truck drove away. Emily stood on the sidewalk for a long moment. her heart slamming against her sternum, and watched the taillights disappear around the corner. Then she took out her phone. She had signal here. She always had signal this close to home, and she called the only number she'd added to her contacts in the last 5 days. Bear picked up on the second ring. She couldn't speak into a phone. That wasn't how it worked. But he'd set it up so that she could text directly to his number, and his phone would read the messages aloud to him. He'd figured that out himself, shown up at Nora's door 2 days ago to explain it with a piece of paper he'd clearly drafted and redrafted before he brought it over. She typed, "A man in a black truck just found me. He knew who I was." He said, "Wrong choice." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then, "Don't move. I'm coming." She looked at the corner where the truck had turned. She looked at the familiar street she'd walked down 1,000 times. She looked at her grandmother's house, the lights on in the kitchen window. Nora in there right now making dinner and not knowing. She typed, "Bear, I think I'm in trouble." His reply came in under 10 seconds. "Not anymore. We've got you." She read those 3 words standing alone on a sidewalk in Red Hollow, Arizona. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she believed them. Bear arrived in 11 minutes. Emily knew this because she had been counting, standing on the sidewalk outside her grandmother's house, back against the fence post, eyes on the corner where the black truck had disappeared. Counting seconds, the way she used to count steps on a bad day when anxiety made her feel like the world was tilting. 1,000, 1,000. She had gotten to 640 before the headlights swept around the opposite one corner, and Bear's truck pulled up, followed immediately by 2 motorcycles running tight and fast. He was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. He came to her directly. No hesitation. And he looked at her face the way someone looks at a person they're assessing for damage quickly. Thoroughly. Cataloging. Then he held up his phone so she could see the screen, where he'd already typed, "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. He typed again, "Tell me exactly what he looked like." She took his phone and typed back, her fingers steadier than she expected. Thin. Maybe 45. Dark hair going gray at the temples. He was wearing a collared shirt like a dress shirt. The truck was black, newer model. Chevy, I think. Arizona plates, but I only caught the first 3 letters. KRW. Bear read it. He turned and said something to the 2 men who'd come on the bikes. She caught the name Dex, and something about a plate. And one of the men was already on his own phone before Bear finished speaking. The other positioned himself between Emily and the street with the practiced ease of someone for whom this was a reflex, not a performance. Bear turned back to her and typed, "You should have called me the second it happened." She took the phone. "It happened 30 seconds before I did call you." He looked at that for a moment. Then something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one quickly controlled. He typed, "Fair enough, come on." She looked toward her grandmother's house. The kitchen light was still on. "I need to tell my grandmother." He nodded without hesitation. "We'll tell her together." Nora Carter was 73 years old. 4'11", and had spent the better part of 5 decades refusing to be intimidated by anything the world chose to put in front of her, up to and including the rheumatoid arthritis that had been working on her hands for the last 8 years. She opened her front door, took one look at Bear Holloway standing on her porch, 6'2". 230 pounds. Leather vest. Gray eyes. The general energy of a man who had never in his life been uncertain about where he stood, and said, calmly, "I assume this is about Emily." Bear blinked. That surprised him. Emily could see it. "Come in," Nora said, and stepped back from the door. She had the kettle on inside of 90 seconds. Emily sat at the kitchen table and watched her grandmother move through the familiar space, the cabinet where the mugs lived, the drawer for spoons, the small ceramic jar of sugar, and felt something in her chest loosen slightly. The particular comfort of a place that had always been safe. Bear sat across from Emily. He had his notebook out now. The same approach she used, because Carla had apparently informed him that this was the more reliable method when there was a lot of information to exchange and accuracy mattered. Ease. He wrote, "The man who approached you knew your name?" Ease. Emily thought about it. He'd known who she was. That much was clear from the way he'd looked at her. It's the specific, identified quality of it. She wrote back, "He recognized me. He didn't say my name, but he knew exactly who I was." He wasn't guessing. Bear wrote, "That means someone talked." She stared at that line for a moment. Then, "Who knew my name?" Who knew I was involved? He sat back and she watched him think. The way his jaw tightened slightly when he was working through something he didn't like. He wrote the sheriff's office, the deputies who took the report. Possibly people who were in the clubhouse when you came in. And us. Nora set a mug of tea in front of each of them, without being asked. Then sat down at the end of the table. She looked at Bear steadily. What kind of danger is my granddaughter in? Bear looked at Nora with the full attention of a man who respected a direct question. He said. The honest answer is I don't know yet, but I'm treating it like real danger until I know different. Nora nodded once. She turned to Emily and signed, fluid and quick, "You're not sleeping here tonight." Emily started to protest. Nora held up one arthritic hand with the authority of a woman who had been shutting down arguments since before Emily was born. Not up for discussion, she signed. "You'll stay somewhere they can't find you." "I'll be fine." "She'll be fine," Bear said, apparently having caught enough of the exchange to follow the gist. He looked at Nora. "We'll have someone on the street." "You won't see them." "But they'll be there." Nora looked at him for a long moment, with the evaluating gaze of a woman who had raised a deaf grandchild alone and had therefore made a life's work of determining who was trustworthy and who was performing trustworthiness. Whatever she found in Bear Holloway's face apparently satisfied her. "All right," she said, "but I want her to have a way to reach me. Anytime, night or day." "Already handled," Bear said. The house where Emily stayed that first night belonged to Carla's sister, a woman named Diane, who asked no questions, fed her a bowl of soup, and showed her to a bedroom with a window that faced the backyard and a lock on the door that was newer than the rest of the house. Carla came by at 9, sitting on the edge of the bed while Emily changed into borrowed clothes, and got straight to it. "We need to talk about what's actually happening here," Carla said, signing along with her words in the careful, earnest way she always did. Not the sanitized version, the real version. Emily sat down across from her. "Tell me, the men at the warehouse, the 5 that got arrested, they weren't freelancers. They weren't some random crew with a grudge. Someone hired them." Carla paused. "Someone with money and with a specific reason to want our chapter destabilized." "Bear's been running this club for 11 years. He's had enemies before." "This is different." "How different?" "The kind of different that involves lawyers who show up at the county jail inside of 6 hours. Before the families even know there have been arrests." Carla's voice was even. But Emily had spent 20 years reading the things people's bodies said when their voices stayed calm. Carla's hands were tight in her lap. "Someone with resources is behind this. And you're the loose end." Emily absorbed that. She thought about the thin man in the black truck. The flat, assessing way he'd looked at her, the 2 words she'd read on his lips. Wrong choice. Not a threat exactly. More like a verdict. Who is it, Emily wrote. Carla shook her head. Bear's working on that. He's got people working on it. But until we know, you stay close and you don't go anywhere alone. She paused. Then signed more slowly, making sure every word landed. You understand, not anywhere. Not to the diner. Not to the pharmacy. Not to the corner store. Emily nodded. Then she wrote, What about the sheriff? Shouldn't they be? The sheriff's department is aware. Sergeant Calloway is a good man. Carla said it with the particular inflection of someone following a statement with an unspoken but. But the sheriff's department has 42 sworn officers covering 300 square miles of county. And whatever this is, it moves faster than paperwork. Emily thought about that. Ease. She thought about 42 officers and 300 square miles, and a man who had found her on a residential street 5 days after an arrest that had supposedly removed the threat. Ease. You're saying you can protect me better than they can. Ease. Carla met her eyes steadily. I'm saying we're already doing it. She didn't sleep much that night. Ease. She lay on top of the covers in the borrowed room and looked at the ceiling and thought about the decision she'd made 6 days ago on a dirt path outside Red Hollow. It had felt simple in the moment. Danger, people at risk, ease the choice to run toward it instead of away. She had not been heroic about it. She hadn't thought, I am going to be brave. She had thought, I can't walk away from this, which was different. Heroism was a choice you made consciously. What she'd done felt more like an inevitability, like something her body had already decided before her brain caught up. She had not anticipated this. She had not thought past the warning itself, had not thought, and then what? She had run 2 miles and walked through a door and held up a piece of paper and assumed, in whatever unconscious way, that after that the story would be over. That it would resolve itself. She was 20 years old, and she was sleeping in a stranger's house with a lock on the door because someone wanted to make her regret the decision that might have saved 40 lives. She turned onto her side and looked at the locked door. She thought, okay, just that. Okay, the single, quiet, stubborn syllable of a person who has made their peace with the situation in front of them and has decided to face it straight on anyway. Then she closed her eyes, and eventually, around 2 in the morning, she slept. Bear came by at 7:30 with coffee and what turned out to be a significant piece of information. He sat at Diane's kitchen table and wrote while Emily read, the truck. We ran the partial plate, combined with the make and model and the area. Came back to a rental. Rented 4 days ago out of a company in Flagstaff. Paid cash with a card that cleared but traces back to an LLC registered in Nevada that doesn't appear to actually do anything. Emily read it twice. That's not amateur. No, Bear wrote back. It's not. So who working on it? He held up a hand. Not dismissively, more like the gesture of a man who needed her to trust the process for a moment longer. Then he wrote, what I need from you right now is a decision. She waited. The department is going to want you to make a formal statement about the truck. The man. The partial plate. That means your name goes into another report. Which means more people know where I fit into this. Emily finished, writing it out and pushing the notebook back to him. He read it, nodded. What happens if I don't make the statement? He wrote, it limits the official investigation, but it keeps your exposure lower. Emily thought about Sergeant Calloway. She thought about the 6-hour lawyer and the Nevada LLC and the man in the dress shirt who had known exactly who she was on a residential sidewalk in a town with a population of 4,000. She thought about what Carla had said about paperwork and speed. I'll make the statement, she wrote, but I want Sergeant Calloway specifically. No one else in that room. Bear looked at that. Then he looked at her for a long moment. And she had the feeling of being measured, not found wanting, but genuinely assessed, the way a man measures the load-bearing capacity of something before he trusts his weight to it. He wrote, I'll make it happen. Sergeant Pete Calloway arrived at Diane's house at 10:15 with a deputy who waited outside and a digital recorder he kept on the table between them. He's visible, the way honest people set their cards face up. He was 54, built like someone who'd been athletic once, and then life had layered experience on top of it. He's with a gray mustache and reading glasses he put on to review his notes. He wrote his questions on a notepad and slid them across the table. And he waited patiently for Emily's written responses. Reading them without rushing. She decided within the first 5 minutes, he's exactly what Carla had called him. A good man. Tired, navigating more complexity than his job description had promised him. But fundamentally decent. He wrote, you're sure about the lip reading? Wrong choice, those were the exact words. She wrote back, I've been reading lips since I was 4. I'm sure. He nodded slowly. Then he wrote, I have to ask you something. And I want you to know this question is not an accusation. It's me trying to understand the full picture. She looked at him. he continued writing. Is there any part of your previous encounter with these men at the warehouse where you might have been seen? He's recognized even briefly? Emily went still. She had been running. She had been watching them through her peripheral vision. He's keeping her face forward, staying casual. She had been careful. She was almost sure of it. She thought about the moment right before she cleared the fence line. When she'd gone past the bent-back section of chain link, the angle had changed. She'd had half a second where she'd been facing more directly toward the warehouse. And she'd glanced, not at the men specifically, but glanced. It's possible, she wrote, for half a second, at most. Calloway wrote, that's enough. If one of them had his eyes in the right direction at the right moment, and if he had a good memory for faces, then he identified me later. Emily finished writing it before he could. After the arrest. Someone on the outside identified me from a description. Calloway nodded. He wrote, which means the outside person is either running the operation independently, or was never at the warehouse and therefore was never arrested. The implication of that landed in her chest like a stone in still water. The person who organized this, she wrote slowly, they're still free. Calloway looked at what she'd written. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose for a moment. The gesture of a man who was about to say something careful. Then he put his glasses back on and wrote, yes, and they know about you. The meeting that afternoon was the first time Emily saw what the Hells Angels actually were. Beneath the surface of what most people thought they were. Bear called it at 2 o'clock. It happened in the back room of the clubhouse, a room she hadn't been in before. Longer than it appeared from outside, with a table that could seat 20 and currently seated 14. She was the only person in the room who wasn't a member, and she was aware of this the way you're aware of temperature. Not uncomfortably, but precisely. Bear opened it by writing a summary on a whiteboard at the end of the table. Short sentences. Operational information, stripped of anything unnecessary. Emily read it from her seat near the middle of the table and felt the collective attention of 14 people processing the same thing she was processing. Then he looked at her. He said something to the group. And Carla, sitting beside Emily, who hadn't realized until that moment how deliberately Bear had arranged the seating, leaned close and signed the translation. He's telling them what you did. The warehouse. The run. He's telling them that you had every reason to keep walking, and you didn't. Emily looked at the table. He's also telling them. Carla continued, that whatever's coming, you're not facing it alone. A man across the table said something, and his voice had an edge. Emily couldn't hear the edge, but she could see it in the set of his face. The angle of his chin. Carla translated quietly. He's asking why we're responsible for someone who isn't one of us. The room got very still. Bear answered. He didn't raise his voice. She could tell that from how the others around the table sat. Because if he'd raised his voice, they would have reacted differently. He answered quietly. And when he finished, Carla signed to Emily what he'd said. Because she made us her responsibility before she knew if we were worth it. The man across the table said nothing more. What happened over the following 72 hours moved fast, and then stopped completely, and then moved fast again. The rhythm of a crisis that had its own agenda, regardless of anyone's plans. The fast parts. Bear's people identified the Nevada LLC within 36 hours. Through a chain of contacts Emily was not privy to and did not ask about. It traced to a shell company that traced to another shell company that eventually connected to a name, a legitimate businessman from Scottsdale named Warren Aldous, who had a development company, a profile in the Arizona Business Journal, and a very specific land dispute that had been ongoing with a Hells Angels affiliated property owner in the Red Hollow area for 14 months. Emily learned this from Bear in the same written conversation format they'd fallen into as blocky. Economical handwriting, her smaller and more hurried scrawl, passed back and forth across whatever surface was available. She had come to find it oddly intimate. The way communication stripped to its most essential form became somehow more direct. There was no tone of voice to misread. There was no awkward pause while someone looked for words. There was just the words themselves moving between them. Please. So it was about property, she wrote. He wanted to scare you off. Please. Disrupt the club, arrest the leadership, clear the path. Please. Apparently he thought that's how it worked. Bear wrote back. Please, with the flat dryness of a man who found the premise insulting. Please. Does Calloway have enough to move on Aldous? Bear's pause before writing was longer than usual. Please. Getting there. The connection is solid, but the chain of command is thin. Please. Aldous is careful. The men at the warehouse never communicated with him directly. Please. Then how? There's a man in the middle, a go-between. Please. Calloway's people are building the case. Then a line below. Please. It takes time. That's what the law does. It takes time. Please. Emily understood the subtext. She wrote, and while it takes time, please, you stay close, Bear wrote. Not a question. She had been staying in Diane's spare room for 4 days when Carla found her in the kitchen at midnight. He's sitting at the table with a cup of tea. She'd made more out of habit than thirst. He's staring at nothing in particular. Carla sat down across from her. She didn't sign anything immediately. She just sat there. Which was something Emily had noticed about the women in this community. They seemed to understand the value of presence before words. They didn't rush to fill silence with sound. After a moment, Carla signed. How are you actually doing? Emily thought about it honestly. Scared, she signed. But more than that, strange. Like I walked through a door I didn't know was there, and now I can't find it from this side. Carla absorbed that. What do you mean? I mean, my life before this. My routine. The diner. The walk home. My grandmother's kitchen. The same 4 walls. Emily, it was small, but it was mine. And now, it doesn't. She hesitated over the right sign. It doesn't fit the same way. Carla nodded slowly. She signed. Because you're not the same. I ran 2 miles. Emily signed. A little frustrated. I handed someone a piece of paper. I didn't climb a mountain. You decided, Carla signed back. And there was something precise and deliberate in how she formed the words. Most people spend their whole lives never having to find out what they'd do in a moment like that. You found out. You have to live with knowing now. A pause. That's not small. Emily looked down at her hands. Then she signed. I'm scared they're going to find me before Calloway builds his case. I know, and I'm scared that even if they don't, this never actually resolves. That Aldous just waits, hires someone else. I know that too. So what do I do with that? Carla was quiet for a moment. Then she signed carefully. You let people help you. Which I know is hard for you. I can see it every time someone does something for you. You get this look like you're calculating how to pay it back. She tilted her head. Stop calculating. Just let it land. Emily felt the accuracy of that like a physical thing. She looked at Carla for a long moment, and the history of 20 years of managing her own world, of being the person who made things easier for everyone else, because it was the only way to justify taking up space, pressed against the inside of her chest. She signed. I don't know how to do that. Yes, you do, Carla signed. You walk through our door. You're sitting in my sister's kitchen at midnight talking to me. You're already doing it. She reached across the table and briefly covered Emily's hands with her own just for a moment. Just long enough to mean something. The rest follows. The call came at 6 the next morning. Emily felt her phone vibrate on the nightstand and grabbed it before she was fully awake. The text was from Bear. 4 words, we need you now. She was dressed in under 3 minutes. Bear met her in the driveway. His face was set in the particular configuration she'd learned to read over the past week, the look of a man carrying information he didn't like but was carrying straight. Without flinching. He handed her his phone with a message already typed. Calloway found the go-between. He's talking. But there's a problem. She typed, what problem? Part of what he told them involves you specifically. Aldous gave instructions about you, about making sure you didn't become a credible witness. The go-between has details. She processed that. So the threat was more organized than a truck pulling up and saying 2 words at me. The threat was always organized, Bear wrote. We just now know how organized. She handed him back his phone. She looked at the pale early light on the horizon and thought about Warren Aldous in his Scottsdale office and his Arizona Business Journal profile and his very careful, very deliberate chain of insulation between himself and everything that had been pointed in her direction. She thought about the Kellner warehouse and 5 men with guns. She thought about the fact that she had run 2 miles in work shoes, and it had mattered. It had actually measurably mattered. She took Bear's phone again and typed, "What do you need me to do?" Bear read it. Then he looked at her for a moment, that same assessing, thorough look, and typed back, "Calloway wants a second formal interview. Everything you know. Everything you saw. The truck. The words. All of it. It goes into the official record and it strengthens the case. Which means my name is more out there." Yes. She looked at that single word. She thought about what Carla had said the night before. Let it land. She thought about 40 lives and 5 armed men and a dirt path in the Arizona heat and the decision she'd already made once before. Standing in a place very much like this one, with the same basic question in front of her, keep walking or run toward it. She typed, "Set up the interview." Bear took his phone back. He started composing a message. And she watched his thumbs move, and she felt the particular quality of a decision that is made not because you're certain, but because you're committed. Because you looked at who you were in the moment that mattered, and you decided you'd rather be that person all the way through than bail out when it got complicated. She had started this. She was going to finish it. Behind her, inside the house, she heard, or rather felt, in the vibration of footsteps, Carla coming to the kitchen door. She turned. Carla was standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a look that asked the question without requiring words. Emily nodded. Carla handed her a cup. She signed one word, Good. And then, for the first time since the man in the black truck had found her on a residential sidewalk and said 2 words she would never unhear, Emily almost smiled. The second interview with Sergeant Calloway lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Emily had expected it to feel like the first one, formal, careful, the back and forth of a man building a record with precision. And it started that way. Calloway came in with his recorder and his notepad and his reading glasses and the same fundamental decency she'd clocked in him the first time. But 20 minutes in, he slid a photograph across the table. And the nature of the meeting changed entirely. The photograph showed Warren Aldous. She'd looked him up herself after Bear told her the name. The Arizona Business Journal profile had a headshot. The kind of corporate photograph that was designed to communicate trustworthiness through good lighting and a conservative tie. This was not that photograph. This was a surveillance image. Grainy and shot from distance, and it showed Aldous standing outside a building she didn't recognize. He's talking to a man she did. The man from the black truck. She stared at the photograph for a moment. Then she looked at Calloway. He was watching her reaction carefully, and she appreciated that he didn't rush it, didn't prompt her or nudge her toward a response. He just waited, with the patience of a man who understood that what people's faces did in the first 10 seconds after seeing something was often more informative than anything they said afterward. She picked up the pen and wrote, "That's him, the man from the truck." Calloway wrote, "His name is Dennis Farrow. He has a history mostly white collar. He's a wire fraud conviction in 2019 that got pleaded down to a fine. He's been Aldous's fixer for approximately 6 years. Errands that Aldous doesn't want on his own calendar." Emily read that and thought about the phrase errands that Aldous doesn't want on his own calendar, and the specific category of errand that apparently included driving to a residential street in a small Arizona town to deliver a 2-word message to a 20-year-old woman. She wrote, "Is Farrow the go-between, the one who's talking?" Calloway shook his head. He wrote, "Farrow is not talking. The go-between is a third man, someone between Farrow and the 5 at the warehouse. A man named Cutter, which is almost certainly not his real name. He reached out to the sheriff's department through a lawyer 2 days ago and offered cooperation in exchange for considerations." What kind of considerations? Reduced charges. Relocation assistance. Calloway paused. He's genuinely afraid. Whatever he knows about Aldous, knowing it frightens him. Emily thought about that, a man frightened enough to turn on the people who hired him, to voluntarily enter a system that would require him to testify, to put his name on a document that connected him to all of it. Whatever Cutter knew, it was bad enough that the prospect of hiding it felt more dangerous than the prospect of revealing it. What does he know? She wrote. Calloway looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something, stopped, crossed it out, and wrote it again more carefully. He knows that Aldous's instructions, relayed through Pharaoh, included specific provisions about you, not just intimidation. He has documentation of a conversation in which Pharaoh discussed, I'm going to use the precise language here, ensuring your silence in a permanent manner if the intimidation failed. Emily read that sentence 3 times. The room didn't change. The table was still the table. Calloway was still Calloway. The recorder was still blinking its small red light in her peripheral vision. Everything was exactly as it had been 10 seconds ago. And yet something had shifted in the way the air felt, the way her own heartbeat sounded felt in her chest. Permanent manner. She set the pen down very carefully on the table. Calloway wrote, I'm sorry to put that in front of you directly. You deserve to know the actual scope of what you're dealing with. She picked the pen back up. Her hand was not shaking. Which surprised her, she wrote. Does Bear know? I called him this morning. What was his response? Calloway's expression shifted. Something complicated moved across it. And he wrote he was very calm, which in my experience with that man, means he was extremely not calm. Emily almost said something. Instead she wrote, what do you need from me? Everything you have. The warehouse, the run, the clubhouse, the truck, the words, Pharaoh's face. All of it formally recorded with enough detail to be corroborating testimony for what Cutter is providing. Calloway looked at her over his glasses. You're not just a witness anymore. Emily. You're the anchor of this case. She left the interview at 12:40, and Bear was waiting for her outside with Rook, who had become a kind of secondary presence over the past week, not intrusive, just consistently there, the way a certain kind of person shows up when things are serious and stays without requiring an explanation of why. Bear walked to her immediately. He didn't write anything. He just looked at her face and said, slowly and clearly so she could read his lips, Calloway told you. She nodded. He nodded back, like they were both just acknowledging a thing that was true, and neither of them was going to perform a reaction about it. Then he wrote on his phone, how are you? She thought about whether to answer that honestly or efficiently. She decided on both. She took his phone and typed, I'm scared, I'm also angry. The angry is helping. He read it and typed, good. Keep the angry. Rook said something from behind Bear, and Bear half turned and answered him. Emily caught Rook's name and the word car and what might have been an address. Bear turned back to her and typed, we're going to the clubhouse. I want everyone in the same room. Okay, she typed. You don't have to come if... She gave him back the phone before he finished the sentence. He looked at the screen, then at her. She had typed, I'm coming. He put his phone in his pocket. He said, out loud, reading her directly, you know you're the toughest person I've dealt with in a long time. And I deal with some genuinely tough people. She looked at him for a moment. Then she typed on her own phone, you told me to keep the angry. I'm keeping it. He almost smiled. He had a way of almost smiling that she'd come to recognize as its own distinct expression, more specific than an actual smile. More communicative. Let's go, he said. The room had more people in it than she'd seen since the first day she'd walked through the door. She counted quickly, 23, maybe 24. Including several faces she didn't recognize, men who had the look of having traveled to be here. Something in their posture that said they weren't from Red Hollow and hadn't been expecting to be here when the week started. Bear ran the meeting. She sat beside Carla again, and Carla translated in real time with the focused intensity of someone who understood that every word mattered and that speed and accuracy were equally required. Emily watched Bear and watched the room and tried to absorb both simultaneously. He laid it out plain. Aldous, Pharaoh, the land dispute. He's the warehouse, the organized nature of it, the funding, he's the chain of insulation Aldous had built between himself and everything downstream. He's. And then she watched the room's face change when Bear said this. He's watched the particular quality of stillness that moved through 23 men when information lands that recalibrates everything he told them about the instructions Pharaoh had passed down. He's what Cutter had documented, what permanent manner meant when the intimidation failed. He's Carla's signing slowed slightly on that phrase, not from hesitation but from emphasis. He's making sure Emily caught every syllable. A man near the back said something short and flat. Ease. Carla didn't translate it, but Emily read it from across the room without difficulty. Ease. She'd encountered that particular word in lip reading before. Ease. Bear spoke again, and Carla translated. He's saying this isn't about the land anymore. Ease. This became personal. The moment, Aldous pointed something at a 20-year-old woman who had nothing to do with any of it, except that she did the right thing. He's saying that changes the nature of what we do next. The room agreed. She could see the agreement move through it, the way weather moves not unanimously timed, but moving in the same direction. A man she hadn't seen before. One of the unfamiliar faces stood up and said something. Carla translated. He's from the Tucson chapter. He's saying he made some calls this morning. He wants Bear to know there are people ready to come if it comes to that. Bear said something back. Carla, Bear is saying it won't come to that. That they're going to let the law do its part first. But he appreciates the call. The Tucson man sat down. He didn't look entirely satisfied with that answer. But he sat. Then Bear looked directly at Emily and said something. And Carla's translation came a half-second later, with a slight catch in her voice that Emily noticed. He's telling everyone in the room that they are here because she is here. That whatever this chapter is going to do, she is the reason it's worth doing. Emily looked at the table in front of her. A man to her left, one of the ones she recognized from the first day. Heavyset, with a red beard going gray, reached over and put his fist briefly on the table in front of her. Not a knock, just a placement, a gesture, that in this room apparently meant something she didn't need a translation for. She put her fist next to his. The twist that broke the case came from a direction nobody had been watching. It came from Doug Perkins. Doug Perkins, her manager at Pauline's Diner, who had given her the schedule on Post-it notes and spoken to her loudly and never looked at her directly. Doug Perkins had, it emerged, been approached by Dennis Pharaoh 6 days ago. Pharaoh had come into the diner during Emily's absence. Ordered coffee he didn't drink and asked Perkins casual questions about his deaf employee. What her schedule was, what route she took home, whether she had family in town, whether anyone came to pick her up. Perkins had answered. All of it. Emily found out because Perkins called Calloway's office himself. The morning after Calloway's investigation surfaced the connection. Apparently, Perkins had seen a news brief about the Kellner warehouse arrests. The story had stayed low profile but not invisible, and something had connected in his head. And he'd sat on it for 5 days before the weight of it became too heavy, and he picked up the phone. He did not call Emily. He called the sheriff. Calloway told Bear. Bear told Emily. In writing. Across the kitchen table at Diane's house. While the morning light came through the window, and Carla sat 2 chairs down, pretending to read something. Emily read Bear's message 3 times. Then she set the notebook down and looked at the wall. She thought about Doug Perkins, about 11 months of Post-it notes and loud, exaggerated speech, and the particular brand of inconvenience he'd made her feel like she was. Day in and day out. She thought about the fact that Pharaoh had walked into the diner and asked questions, and Perkins had answered them, and that chain of information had put a man in a black truck on her street with 2 words on his lips. And then she thought about the fact that Perkins had called. That 5 days of sitting with what he'd done had apparently been enough to move him to do the harder thing. She picked up the pen and wrote, "Is he cooperating with Calloway?" Bear wrote, "Fully. He gave a recorded statement this morning. He's scared. He's also sorry he told Calloway he didn't understand what he was being asked or why. And I believe that part is true." A pause then. What Pharaoh did was count on someone not thinking too hard about a deaf girl. Please. Emily looked at that last line for a long time. He wasn't wrong about that. Please, she wrote. People don't think too hard about me. It's been true my whole life. Please, Bear wrote. It was true. It's not the situation anymore. Please. She looked at the distinction he'd drawn. It was very deliberate. He's very precise was true. Not anymore. Like he was marking the line cleanly between a before and an after. She appreciated that. She appreciated that he didn't dress it up. She wrote, does this help Calloway's case? Perkins talking? It puts Pharaoh at the diner. It documents that he was gathering information about you specifically, with enough detail to be construed as surveillance. Combined with Cutter's testimony in the plate trace, Bear stopped writing, then started again. Calloway thinks they can move on Aldous within the week. Emily's chest tightened. Not with fear this time. With something else. Something that took her a moment to identify. Because she so rarely felt it in a clean, uncomplicated form. She felt it as, let's end this. The call that came 3 days later arrived at 11 in the morning as Emily was sitting with Nora at Nora's kitchen table. She'd been allowed back home with 2 of Bear's people on the street. A compromise she had negotiated herself in writing. Through a conversation with Bear that had taken 40 minutes and involved him starting several sentences and then crossing them out before she pointed at the crossed out parts and raised her eyebrows until he rewrote them honestly. She'd missed her grandmother's kitchen. She'd missed the specific quality of being in a space where her disability had never been something that required management or apology. Nora talked to her in ASL and wrote when the conversation got complex, and never once in Emily's memory had looked at her with pity. The kitchen felt like the interior of something safe. She felt her phone vibrate and looked at the screen. Bear. Calloway's office just called. They executed the warrant. Aldous is in custody as of 40 minutes ago. She read the message and read it again, and then she put the phone face down on the table and pressed her hands flat against the surface and breathed. Nora watched her. She signed good news. Emily picked up the phone and showed Nora the message. Nora read it. She set the phone down. She folded her hands on the table. The arthritic fingers that had drilled ASL handshapes by flashlight when Emily was 4. And she looked at her granddaughter for a moment. Then she signed, slow and deliberate. I want you to understand something. What you did, the running, the warning, anyone might have done that. Plenty of people would have done that. Emily started to sign back, but Nora held up one finger. What you did after the interviews, the statement, sitting in rooms full of strangers and telling the truth over and over when the truth was dangerous. That's what most people don't do. That's the part that's harder. And you did it without flinching. Emily's throat was tight. She signed. He flinched. I was scared the whole time. I know, Nora signed. That's exactly what I mean. But the arrest of Warren Aldous was not the end of it. Emily was beginning to understand that in cases like this, the arrest was not the end, but the beginning of a different kind of ordeal, slower. More procedural, but in its own way just as exhausting. Because Aldous had lawyers. Good ones, the kind who showed up within hours and immediately began building the architecture of reasonable doubt. Because Pharaoh, who Calloway had hoped, would flip once his employer was in custody, instead went completely silent, not a word, not a movement. Sitting behind his own legal team with the patience of someone who had been prepared for this possibility. Because Cutter, the go-between who was supposedly cooperating, suddenly became harder to reach, his lawyer asking for delays. Citing his client's health, citing the complexity of the agreement, citing things that Calloway described to Bear in a phone call that Bear relayed to Emily as, he's stalling. Someone's gotten to him. She was in the back room of the clubhouse when Bear told her this. Writing it across the table while 2 other men sat at the far end working on something she wasn't part of. She read his message and felt the familiar press of the anger that had been sustaining her. She wrote, if Cutter walks back his cooperation, what happens to the case? Bear was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was choosing honesty over reassurance. He wrote, it gets weaker. Calloway still has the physical evidence from the warehouse. Ease. He has Perkins' statement. He has the plate trace and the surveillance image. Ease. But Cutter was the connective tissue between Farrow and Aldous specifically. Ease. Without him, Aldous might walk, she wrote. Bear didn't write no. He wrote Calloway is aware. He's working it. She sat with that for a moment. She looked around the room, the table. The two men across it, the door to the main hall. She thought about 40 minutes of testimony she'd given across 2 formal interviews. She thought about the photograph of Farrow that Calloway had slid across the table. She thought about the phrase permanent manner and what it had meant and who had decided to mean it. She wrote, what if I talked to Cutter? Bear's head came up from the notebook immediately. He looked at her. She kept her face neutral and waited. He wrote, absolutely not. Bear, that is not happening. I'm not asking you to arrange it. I'm asking what would happen if Emily. He wrote her name alone, which she'd come to understand was his version of a particular tone of voice, firm. Not unkind, but done with the discussion. Cutter is a man who worked as a connector between a fixer and 5 men with weapons. He is not someone you have a conversation with. She looked at what he'd written. Then she wrote, I'm not afraid of him. Bear looked at her for a long moment. Then he wrote something, stopped, and then wrote something different. I know you're not. That's specifically what worries me. She almost laughed at that. She came closer to laughing in that moment than she had in 2 weeks. She wrote, I won't talk to Cutter, but Bear Calloway needs something. He needs the case to hold. Is there anything else I haven't given him? Anything I saw at the warehouse or anything from Farrow's approach that I haven't formally documented. Bear thought about it. Wrote the map. You mentioned a map. The men were gathered around a paper. You said at the time it looked like a map or a diagram. She nodded. She'd mentioned it once, early. In the immediate chaos of the first few hours. And in the formal interviews it had come up briefly, but she hadn't been able to add much detail. She hadn't been close enough. She'd seen the paper and the cluster of people around it and drawn the inference. What if I could identify the building in the diagram? She wrote, I grew up here. If it was a diagram of the clubhouse, Bear sat up slightly. He wrote, you said you were 40 yards away. I was. But I have good visual memory, and I've been in this building now. I know the layout, the shape of the roof, the way the parking lot runs. She wrote faster because something was clicking together in her mind. If Calloway showed me a layout diagram of this building and I could say yes. That's the shape of what they were looking at. That's corroborating evidence. That documents what they were planning. Bear read it. Read it again. Set the notebook down, picked it back up. Wrote, I'll call Calloway. She spent 2 hours that afternoon with Calloway and an investigator she hadn't met before, a woman named Santos from the state attorney's office. Brisk and thorough and refreshingly free of the softening impulse that made some people talk to Emily like she was made of something breakable. Santos asked precise questions, passed them in writing, and accepted precise answers without asking Emily to elaborate beyond what was necessary. Emily respected her immediately. The diagram exercise produced something. It was not a definitive case-closing identification. She had been too far away for that. But when Santos showed her 3 building layouts, the clubhouse, 2 other structures chosen as controls, Emily identified the clubhouse layout on the second pass, with enough specific detail about the parking lot configuration and the roofline angle that Santos made a note in the margin and underlined it twice. Calloway walked her out afterward, and for a moment, just a moment, in the narrow corridor between the interview room and the exit, he stopped and said something without writing it first. He was facing her, and she read his lips without difficulty. You know, in 22 years, I don't think I've ever had a witness come back to me and say, what else do you need? Usually I'm chasing people down. He paused. Usually people want it to be over. She thought about the right response. Then she said, not signed, said, in the careful way she'd been speaking in low-stakes situations since she was a child. The voice that people always seemed to be surprised was as clear as it was, it is going to be over. I just want it to be over correctly. Calloway nodded. He looked like he wanted to say something else, then decided against it. Ease. He opened the door for her. Outside, Rook was leaning against Bear's truck. Ease. And when he saw her come out, he straightened and said something, and she caught Bear's inside in 5 minutes. Ease. She nodded and stood in the afternoon sun and let herself feel the day. Ease. It was warmer than it had been. The heat was less aggressive. Ease. More like pressure than an assault. The kind of Arizona summer heat that stopped fighting you and just settled in. Ease. She'd always found it oddly comforting when the heat did that. Ease. Like it had made its point and was willing to coexist. Ease. She was standing there, eyes half closed, when Rook appeared at her elbow and nudged her arm. Ease. She opened her eyes. He was holding his phone out to her, turned, so she could see the screen where he'd typed, Ease. Bear says to tell you that Calloway just got a call from Cutter's lawyer. Ease. Cutter wants to renegotiate. Apparently the arrest of Aldous changed his calculation. Ease. She looked at that message. She looked at Rook's face. Ease. Which had the expression of someone carrying good news, but trying not to show it too, obviously. Ease. She took his phone and typed back, "How is Bear?" Rook read it. Ease. Typed, "He's got the almost smile." She handed the phone back. Ease. She looked at the sky above the parking lot, the deep, late afternoon blue of the Arizona sky. Ease. The kind of sky that had no ambivalence in it. Ease. That committed fully to the direction it was going. Ease. She thought, we're getting there. And then she thought, Ease, this is only half of it. Getting a conviction is not the same as being safe. Ease. Getting Aldous off the board is not the same as having a life that makes sense again. Ease. She thought about her grandmother's kitchen and Pauline's diner and the laminated card she hates herself with the common phrases. Ease. The daily management of a world that required her to make herself smaller and easier and less inconvenient. Ease. She thought about who she'd been on July 17th when she'd set out on that dirt path thinking about groceries and the electric bill. Ease. She thought, I can't go back to that. I don't think I'm supposed to. Ease. But she wasn't sure yet what she was supposed to go forward to. Ease. What the shape of it was. What you did when the crisis that had hollowed you out and filled you back up with something different had started. Ease. Finally, to resolve when the emergency that had given you a reason to be fully alive every single moment had started to give way to something more ordinary. Ease. She was still turning that over when Bear came out. Ease. Phone in hand, and walked directly to her and held the screen up so she could read it. Ease. It said, Cutter confirmed. Full cooperation. He's giving them everything. Ease. She looked at that for a long time. Long enough that Bear finally wrote one more line below it. Ease, Emily. It's enough. Calloway has enough. She handed his phone back. Ease. She looked at him at the gray eyes and the certain face and the man who had read her in 5 seconds on the worst afternoon of her life and said, I believe you like. It was the simplest thing in the world. Ease. She signed, slowly and clearly, something she'd never tried with him before. Ease. 2 words, basic, the kind of ASL she'd learned when she was 3 years old. Ease. Thank you. Bear looked at her hands. He had been, she knew, picking up bits of ASL over the past 2 weeks in the same quiet, unpublicized way he did most things she'd caught him watching tutorial videos on his phone twice. Had said nothing, had filed it away. He brought his right hand to his chin and moved it forward. The ASL sign for thank you, done imperfectly but unmistakably. Emily felt something break open her chest, quietly and completely. And for once she didn't turn her face away. Cutter's full cooperation broke the case, opened the way a crowbar breaks a lock, not elegantly, but completely. Over the course of 4 days, he gave the state attorney's office everything. Names, dates, wire transfer records he'd kept copies of. Apparently, as insurance against exactly this kind of situation. Conversations he'd documented in writing because he'd never fully trusted Pharaoh and had wanted leverage. The chain was clear now, airtight in the places where it had previously been thin. Aldous to Pharaoh, Pharaoh to Cutter, Cutter to the 5 men at the warehouse. And threaded through all of it, specific and documented. The instructions about Emily. The timeline. The escalation from surveillance to intimidation to something that Cutter's own lawyer described in a filing Emily never saw, but that Bear relayed to her in careful, edited summary as a directive inconsistent with his client's moral threshold. She read that phrase inconsistent with his client's moral threshold and felt a laugh move through her that was more exhaustion than humor. Ease. She was sitting in Bear and Carla's kitchen when Bear showed her the summary. Ease. At a table she'd now sat at enough times that she had a chair she thought of as hers. Ease. The one closest to the window, where the afternoon light came in, at an angle that was easier on her eyes when she was reading. It was the kind of detail that accumulated without announcement. Ease. The chair. Carla's habit of putting Emily's coffee on the counter within reach before she'd asked for it. Ease. The way Bear had started turning slightly toward her when he spoke, even in conversations that weren't directed at her. Ease. So she could follow the room. These things happened gradually, and then they were just true. Ease. She wrote on Bear's notepad, so Cutter had a moral threshold. Ease. He just said it. It might be used as evidence against me. Bear read it and made a sound she couldn't hear but recognized from his expression as something between a laugh and a sigh. He wrote back. He cooperated. I'm not going to waste energy on why. He's fair, she wrote. Calloway says arraignment is in 10 days. The DA's office is confident. Bear paused, pen still on paper. He's then added, Aldous made bail. $250,000. Personal recognizance with electronic monitoring. He's not going anywhere, but he's not in a cell. Emily absorbed that. She wrote, and Farrow, still silent, still lawyered up. Ease. Bear set the pen down. He picked it back up. Calloway thinks Farrow is waiting to see how the Aldous defense shapes up before deciding where he lands. Ease. If Aldous' lawyers can create enough doubt, Farrow might stay quiet and take his chances. Ease. If the case against Aldous looks like it's going to hold, then Farrow might decide talking is better than going down with him. Ease. Emily finished. Bear nodded. She sat with the whole picture for a moment. Ease. The legal architecture of it, the way it moved so differently from the physical danger she'd been navigating for the past 2 weeks slower, is more opaque, happening in rooms she'd never be in. He's driven by calculations she couldn't fully see. She had done everything Calloway had asked. She had given every piece of testimony available to her. The case was Calloway's now. The outcome was the court's. She wrote, this is the hardest part. Bear looked at what she'd written. He understood immediately. He wrote, waiting, not being able to do anything. I know, he wrote. Then, there's something else I want to talk to you about. Not the case. Something separate. She looked at him. He wrote slowly. More carefully than usual. Like a man who had thought about the phrasing. You said something to Carla a few weeks ago about your life not fitting the same way anymore. About not knowing what you go forward to. Emily went still. She hadn't known Bear was aware of that conversation. She looked toward the hallway, then back at him. He wrote, she told me, not as gossip, because she thought I should know, and because she was right. He turned the notepad fully toward her. What do you want, Emily? Not what's safe. Not what makes sense from the outside. What do you actually want? It was the most direct question anyone had asked her in years. She felt its weight. She picked up the pen and held it for a moment before writing. Then, I want to stop being invisible. I spent 20 years being the person who made herself easy to overlook, and I am done with it. She passed the notepad back. Bear read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote, what does not invisible look like? She hadn't let herself think about it that concretely before. It had been an absence she was naming, not a shape she'd built. But she picked up the pen and wrote without stopping. It looks like work that means something. It looks like people who sign when they talk to me without being asked. Not because they pity me, but because it's how we talk. It looks like using what happened this for something. I don't know what yet, but something. Bear read every word. He set the notepad down. He looked at her directly, the full, unhurried attention of a man who was not in a hurry to respond and knew the difference between a conversation that needed an answer quickly and one that needed a different kind of weight. He wrote, okay, let's figure that out. Carla came into the kitchen 20 minutes later and took one look at the two of them. At the notepad between them covered in layered writing, and said, you've been making plans. She said it the way someone says a thing they suspected was happening and are pleased to have confirmed. Bear said something Emily couldn't catch, directed at Carla. Carla signed back to Emily. He says he's been thinking about it for a week and was waiting for you to stop being too stubborn to have the conversation. He's. Emily looked at Bear. He had the almost smile. She signed at Carla. He's. What did he actually say? Carla signed. That's what he actually said. He's. Bear pushed the notepad across to Emily and pointed at what she'd written, the I want to stop being invisible. He's. I want to use what happened for something. Then he wrote below it. He's. There's a program. Regional. Works with deaf youth. He's. Teenagers mostly who are aging out of school services and landing in employment gaps because employers don't know how to accommodate them and nobody's teaching them to advocate for themselves. He paused. It's underfunded. Badly. And it doesn't have anyone who's actually lived it running any part of it. Emily read it and looked up at him. He wrote, I know people on the board. I can get you a meeting, but only if you want it. This is not me telling you what your next step is. This is me telling you a door exists. She thought about Doug Perkins and his post-it notes. She thought about the laminated card with common phrases that she'd made to save other people the inconvenience of her. She thought about 15-year-old Emily, who had wanted to run track and had had to stop because a coach who communicated through a whistle couldn't be bothered to find a different system. She wrote, I want the meeting. Bear wrote Monday. Then below that, there's one more thing. He stopped. Started again. The Tucson chapter, they sent someone up here because they heard what was happening. When all of this settles, there's going to be a formal gathering. Chapters coming from around the region. They want to, there's a tradition. When the club acknowledges someone who has demonstrated, he crossed out several words and wrote more simply, they want to honor you, formally, in front of everyone. Emily stared at that. She wrote, why? Bear looked at what she'd written and then looked at her with an expression that was as close to exasperated fondness as she'd seen from him. He wrote, because you ran 2 miles in work shoes to warn strangers. Because you sat in a sheriff's interview room and gave testimony that put a dangerous man on an electronic monitor while his lawyers tried to dismantle your credibility. Because you kept showing up when you had every reason to stop. He put the pen down. Why do you think you have to earn it more than you already have? She didn't have an answer for that. She sat with the question for a long time. The gathering was 3 weeks away. And in those 3 weeks, the case continued to move with the grinding. Incremental momentum of a legal system that operated on its own timeline, regardless of anyone's emotional urgency. Farrow broke on a Wednesday. He didn't flip entirely. He was too careful for that. And his lawyers were too good. But he gave a partial statement that corroborated enough of Cutter's account to close the gap in the chain of command. The DA's office, in a conversation that Calloway relayed to Bear and Bear relayed to Emily, described it as the last piece we needed. The arraignment happened on schedule. Aldous entered a not guilty plea through his lawyers. As expected. A trial date was set for 8 months out. 8 months. Emily turned that number over in her mind. 8 months of Aldous on electronic monitoring in his Scottsdale house. 8 months of lawyers building arguments. 8 months of her name on a witness list. In a case that would eventually require her to sit in a courtroom and testify. She told Bear she understood. And she did. And she was also tired in a way that she hadn't been at the beginning of any of this. Not the physical tiredness of running 2 miles in work shoes. A different kind, the kind that came from holding something tightly for a long time and not being able to put it down. The Monday meeting with the youth program board went differently than she expected. She had gone in prepared to make a case. She'd written out what she wanted to say, her background. What she'd experienced navigating employment as a deaf person. What she'd observed about the gaps between what existing services offered and what young people actually needed. She'd asked Carla to come with her as an interpreter. And Carla had cleared her whole morning without being asked twice. The board chair was a woman in her 60s named Harriet Osei, who had a son who was hard of hearing and had spent 15 years building this program out of a combination of grant funding and stubborn refusal to let it collapse. She shook Emily's hand at the beginning of the meeting and then signed, in fluent ASL that made Emily blink. Carla told me about you. The sign for your name is this, and she made a sign Emily had never had before. A personalized name sign, the way the deaf community assigned them. Incorporating the letter E with a motion that suggested movement. Ease. Running forward. Emily looked at the sign for her own name and felt something shift behind her sternum. Ease. She looked at Harriet. She signed, "You're deaf?" Harriet shook her head. Ease. She signed, "My son. 30 years of learning." She smiled. Ease. You get to a point where it stops feeling like learning and starts feeling like thinking. Ease. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Emily had come prepared to convince Ease. And instead, she found herself in a conversation with people who were already convinced, who had been looking for someone with her specific combination of lived experience and demonstrated nerve. Ease. And who had apparently decided on the basis of what Carla had told them, Ease, that she was the person they'd been looking for. She walked out with a part-time consultancy arrangement, Ease, a start date, and the number for a sign language interpreter coordinator who would support the program's expansion into a new county. Ease. Carla was waiting in the hallway. She looked at Emily's face and said, Ease. Well, Emily signed. They offered me a job. Carla put both hands over her mouth for a moment. Ease. Then she signed rapidly. Bear is going to be insufferable about this. He's going to say he knew. Obviously. Carla shook her head. Ease. That man has been calling in favors for you for 3 weeks. Ease. He just didn't want you to know because he knew you'd argue about it. Ease. Emily thought about that Bear on the phone, Bear making the calls. Ease. Bear building the path quietly while she sat at his kitchen table, thinking she was waiting. Ease. She thought about the chair she'd claimed by the window. Ease. The coffee already on the counter, the ASL tutorial videos on his phone that he'd never mentioned. Ease. She signed. He's terrible at not caring about things. Ease. Carla smiled. Don't tell him I said that. Ease. The night before the gathering. Ease. Emily couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark of her grandmother's house. She'd been back home for 2 weeks now. Ease. With Bear's people, no longer on the street, because the electronic monitor on Aldous had held, and the threat assessment had been formally downgraded, and she looked at the ceiling and tried to organize what she was feeling. Ease. She was not, she discovered, nervous. Or not primarily nervous. Ease. She was something else, something more complex. A feeling that had the shape of standing at a height and looking at how far you've come rather than how far you could fall. Ease. She was thinking about who she had been on July 17th. Ease. The 20-year-old who took the shortcut because it saved 8 minutes. Ease. Who kept her earbuds in to discourage conversation. Ease. Who had the laminated card and the post-it note schedule in 11 months of making herself easy to overlook. Ease. Who ran track for 2 years and stopped because one coach couldn't be bothered. Ease. She was thinking about the fact that she hadn't set out to be anything on that afternoon. Ease. She'd been thinking about groceries and the electric bill. Ease. She hadn't woken up that morning with any intention of changing the direction of her life. Ease. The direction had changed because she'd looked at something and understood what it meant and had been. Ease in that moment, fundamentally unable to walk past it. Ease. She didn't know what to call that. Courage felt too large. Ease too intentional. It had been more like integrity. Ease. The simple, unglamorous refusal to be less than she knew she was. Ease. She had run not because she was brave, but because the alternative was something she could not live inside. Ease. And out of that refusal, out of 2 miles of bad footing and burning lungs and a pen and a notebook had come this. Ease. The chair by the window. Harriet Ossie signed for her name. Ease. A start date. 500 people coming to Red Hollow. Ease. She heard or rather felt through the floor Nora getting up from her room. Ease. The familiar vibration of her grandmother's footsteps. She could map the whole house in footstep vibrations. Ease had been able to, since childhood, knew the difference between Nora's measured nighttime walk and her more purposeful morning stride. Ease. Nora appeared in the doorway, checked that Emily was awake. Ease. And came to sit on the edge of the bed. She signed in the dark. Ease. Which she could do because she knew every shape by feel. Ease. Can't sleep? Emily signed back thinking. About tomorrow? Ease. About everything. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she signed. You know what I remember about when you were little. Ease. You used to watch people's faces so carefully. All the time. Ease. From when you were very small. You'd watch people talking, and then you'd watch the person they were talking to, and you'd look back and forth and figure out what was happening in the space between them. Emily didn't say anything. She waited. Most people never learn to do that. Nora signed. They hear the words and stop there. You had to go past the words to the actual thing underneath. Every single time your whole life. You learn to read the world the way most people never bother. She paused. That's why you saw those men. That's why you understood what you were looking at. Because you've been studying people since before you could walk. Emily felt the truth of that land in her in a way it hadn't when other people said similar things. Because Nora had been watching her for 20 years. Nora had the standing to say it. She signed, I don't want to make too much of it. What I did. Nora signed, I'm not asking you to make anything of it. I'm asking you to understand it accurately. She put her hand briefly over Emily's. There's a difference between pride and accuracy. Tomorrow isn't about pride. What's it about? Nora thought for a moment. She signed, It's about people who needed to say thank you, finding a way to do it that meant something. Let them, that's all. The morning of the gathering. Emily's phone started vibrating at 7:15 and didn't stop. Carla. Bear says leave by 9. I say leave by 8:30. Leave by 8:30. Rook. On the text chain he'd added himself to without explanation 3 weeks ago. Heads up, there's more people coming than we thought. Like significantly more Harriet Osei watching from Tucson. Tell Bear we're proud of the whole chapter. Calloway, which surprised her, won't be there, but wanted you to know Pharaoh's lawyer called this morning. He's entering into a full cooperation agreement. Thought you'd want to hear it today of all days. She read Calloway's message sitting on the edge of her bed. Still in the oversized shirt she'd slept in, and she held the phone in her lap for a moment. Pharaoh. Full cooperation, which meant the chain was complete. Which meant that 8 months from now, when she walked into a courtroom and sat in a witness chair, she would not be doing it alone. She would be the last piece of a structure that had been built carefully from multiple directions, over weeks of work by people who gave a damn. She texted back, thank you for telling me today. Thank you for everything. Calloway, you did the work. I just had the badge. She put her phone down and got ready. They heard the motorcycles before they arrived. Emily felt them first, a vibration that started low and distant and built steadily. The way a frequency builds when its source is moving toward you. Until she was feeling it not just through the floor but through the walls. Through the air itself, a physical presence of sound that she experienced as pressure and rhythm. She was standing outside the clubhouse with Bear and Carla and Rook and a dozen other people she now knew by name. By habit, by the particular ways they communicated with her. And she watched the road. They came around the bend in formation, not the loose, individualistic arrangement of casual riding, but organized, intentional, column after column of motorcycles moving together with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of people who had done this before and knew what it meant. The chrome caught the morning light. The sound, she couldn't hear it, but she could feel it, and she had learned to translate that feeling into something close to understanding was immense. Layered, the accumulated resonance of hundreds of engines in concert. Rook appeared at her elbow. He held up his phone. He'd typed, 500 at least. Probably more. They're still coming around the bend. She looked at the phone. She looked at the road. She looked at the column that was still emerging. Still resolving from the distance into individual machines and individual people. All of them moving toward the place where she was standing. She thought, they came for this, not for a crisis. Not for a fight, not to protect or defend or position themselves against something threatening. They came to be present, to stand in a place and say, with their presence, something that words were insufficient to carry. Bear appeared on her other side. He wrote on his notepad and held it up. You ready? She looked at the road. She looked at him. She thought about everything that ready had meant over the past several weeks, ready to run. Ready to testify, ready to sit in a room full of strangers and tell the truth over and over. Ready to let people help, ready to let something in. She wrote, "I've been ready since July 17th. He's Bear read it. This time he didn't almost smile. He smiled. He's fully, without reservation, the smile of a man whose face has finally caught up with what he'd been feeling for weeks. He's He held up his notepad one more time. He'd written, then let's go. The ceremony. If you could call it that, was not what Emily had expected. She had braced for formality, something that would require her to stand still while things happened around her. The way some ceremonies often were, requiring the honored person to be more object than participant. But that was not how it went. Bear stood in front of 500 people, and he spoke. She couldn't hear him, and there was no real-time translation. And she realized after a moment that this was intentional, that what Bear said to the crowd was his, separate, a thing between him and his community. She watched his face while he spoke, and she watched the crowd listen. And she read the shape of it without needing the words. He was telling a story. He was telling it straight. Without embellishment, the way he did everything. The crowd was very still. Then Bear turned to face her. He wrote something on a card he'd clearly prepared. She recognized the handwriting. The economical block letters, and held it up. You reminded a lot of people what it means to show up for strangers. That's not nothing. That's everything. Then he took something from the man standing beside him. A patch. She could see it from where she was. The design. The colors. The specific insignia she'd come to recognize over weeks of time in this building. He held it out to her. She looked at him. He signed it imperfectly. Haltingly, clearly having practiced and not yet comfortable. But unmistakably for you. You earned it. She took it from his hands. The vibration changed. She felt it. The collective shift of 500 people responding to a single moment. Moving through the ground and up through her feet. She couldn't hear the sound. She felt every bit of it. Rook was somewhere behind her, making a face she'd come to understand. Meant he was not going to discuss his feelings about this, which meant he had a lot of them. Carla was beside Bear, signing to Emily what Bear had said to the crowd, not immediately. But now in summary, he told them about July 17th. He told them what you wrote on the paper. He told them you ran the whole way. He told them you've been showing up every day, since like it's the only thing you know how to do. Carla paused. He told them, your family. Emily looked at the patch in her hands. She looked at the crowd. She looked at Harriet Osie's text on her phone from this morning. At Calloway's message. At the start date on a calendar 3 weeks away. At her grandmother somewhere near the back, who had come because Emily had asked, and who was. Emily would later find out, signing back and forth with 2 members of the Tucson chapter who had apparently done some reading. She looked at Bear. She brought both hands up. She signed, I don't know how to thank 500 people. Bear watched her hands. He understood the shape of it. He signed back the imperfect, practiced sign of a man who was still learning the same word he'd used before. That first time across the parking lot. The word that had undone something in her. Family. She looked at that sign, at his hands making it. At the distance between the person she'd been on July 17th and the person's standing in this parking lot holding a patch while 500 engines ticked and cooled around her. She thought about a dirt path in the Arizona heat, and a pen in her apron pocket, and the 2-mile run that had cracked her life open. She thought, I would do it again, not because it had led here. Not because of the job or the gathering or the patch in her hands. She would do it again because she'd looked at something real and responded to it honestly. And she understood now that this specific quality of honesty, of refusing to look away, was not the thing she'd discovered under pressure. It was the thing she'd always been. The pressure had just made it visible. She looked at Bear one more time. She signed, simple and direct. The same 2 words she'd used 3 weeks ago in a parking lot when she was learning, incrementally to let things in. Thank you. And then the crowd moved. And people came forward. And the morning continued around her, loud and warm and full of the vibration of 500 humans choosing, on an ordinary Tuesday in Red Hollow, Arizona, to show up for someone who had shown up for them. Emily Carter stood in the middle of all of it, 20 years old, and she let it land. The days after the gathering settled differently than Emily had expected. She had anticipated a kind of deflation, the crash that follows intensity. The gray flatness of ordinary life, reasserting itself after weeks of something that had burned at a different temperature. She'd felt that before, smaller versions of it, after hard weeks at the diner or after the end of the track season, those 2 years in high school. The way adrenaline debt collected itself eventually. Regardless of what you wanted. But the deflation didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and more durable. Not excitement. Excitement was too thin, too dependent on external events to sustain itself. What settled into her in the days after the gathering was more like clarity. The specific clarity of a person who has stopped arguing with herself about who she is and what she's for. She started the consultancy work with Harriet Osie's program on a Tuesday morning. 3 days after the gathering, taking the bus to the regional office in Kingman because she didn't own a car, and the bus gave her 40 minutes to think. She sat in the back with her notebook open and wrote down everything she wanted to understand in the first week. Questions she had about the program's existing structure. Gaps she'd already identified from the intake documents Harriet had emailed over. By the time the bus reached Kingman, she'd filled 6 pages. Harriet met her at the door. She signed, "You look like someone who did homework." Emily signed back, "I have questions." Harriet smiled. Good, that means you're already doing the job." The program served 43 young people currently, between the ages of 16 and 22, in a 4-county area that included Red Hollow. Most of them were in some stage of the gap Harriet had described out of school services. Not yet in employment, navigating a labor market that was structurally unprepared for them, and often personally unkind about it. Emily spent her first morning reading case files and her first afternoon sitting in on a group session run by a hearing coordinator named Marcus, who was good-hearted and thoroughly ASL literate and openly relieved to have someone in the room who could tell him when his signing was drifting into incomprehensibility. She met a 17-year-old named Jordan, who reminded her so much of herself at that age that it was briefly disorienting. The same watchful quality. The same careful economy of movement, the same way of reading the room before committing to anything. Jordan had been deaf since birth like Emily, had grown up in a hearing family that had learned exactly enough ASL to get by, and had the specific exhaustion of someone who had spent 17 years being the person in every room who accommodated everyone else. Emily sat with Jordan for 20 minutes after the group session while Marcus talked to another participant. She didn't have a plan for the conversation. She just sat there. And after a moment, Jordan signed, "You're the one from the news." The warehouse thing. Emily nodded. "Were you scared?" The whole time, Emily signed. Every single day of it. Jordan looked at her. "But you still did it." "I didn't do it because I wasn't scared." Emily signed. "I did it because I was more scared of the alternative. Of knowing something was wrong and deciding it wasn't my problem." Jordan absorbed that for a moment. Then signed, "My caseworker says I have to practice asking for accommodations in job interviews." She gave me a script. Emily looked at the folder Jordan was holding. She could see the edge of a printed document. The kind of thing that was well-intentioned and probably accurate and completely disconnected from the actual experience of being a deaf teenager in a job interview with someone who had never thought about deafness for one moment before you walked in the door. She signed, "Can I see it?" Jordan handed it over. Emily read it. She handed it back. She signed, "The script isn't wrong." But it's missing something. You want to know what actually works? Jordan sat up slightly. "Yeah, you walk in like you already know you're the best option." Emily signed, not aggressive, just certain. Because here's what they don't tell you: the person across the table is nervous too. They don't know how to talk to you. They're worried about saying something wrong. They're already imagining the accommodations being complicated. Your job is to make it simple. You're not asking permission to exist. You're telling them how to work with an excellent employee. Jordan stared at her for a long moment, then signed. Nobody ever said it that way. Nobody said it that way to me either. Emily signed. I had to figure it out by accident. Jordan looked down at the script and then back at Emily and signed, "Can you help me practice? Not the script. The actual way." Ease. Emily felt something settle in her chest, something that had the exact shape of Harriet Osei making her a name sign on the first day they met. Ease. The specific feeling of being in the right place, doing the right thing. Ease. Unambiguous, not requiring interpretation. She signed, "Ease. That's exactly why I'm here." She was 3 weeks into the job when the twist she hadn't seen coming arrived from the direction she'd least expected. Ease. Doug Perkins called. Not called, he couldn't call her. Ease. She didn't do phone calls, but he showed up at the program's Kingman office on a Wednesday afternoon. Ease. Which was the only explanation she'd been given, because Harriet had come to find her with a slightly complicated expression and written on a notepad, "Ease, there's a man in the lobby. Says his name is Doug Perkins. Ease. Says he used to be your manager. He seems nervous. Ease." Emily looked at that for a moment. She thought about 11 months of post-it note schedules and loud, "Ease." Exaggerated speech. She thought about the conversation Farrow had with him. Ease. And the information Perkins had given, and the 5 days Perkins had sat with that information before calling Calloway. Ease. She wrote back to Harriet, "Send him in." He looked smaller than she remembered. Ease. Which she recognized as a function of context. He'd always been large in the diner. Ease. In the space where he had authority and she was the employee. Ease. And here he was, just a heavy-set man in his 50s, sitting in a chair in a program office with his hands clasped in front of him and the specific posture of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say. Ease. And isn't confident the rehearsal covered everything. Ease. She sat across from him. She put a notepad between them. Ease. He wrote, in large letters, "Ease." The way people often wrote to her when they didn't know what she preferred. "Ease, I wanted to apologize. In person. I know that might not mean anything, but I wanted to try." Ease. She read it. She picked up the pen. She wrote, "Okay. Ease. Go ahead." He looked at that, and she could see him recalibrating. He'd expected something from her before the apology. Ease. Some acknowledgement or preamble, and her directness had caught him off balance. Ease. He wrote, "I told that man things about you. About your schedule. Ease. Your route home. I didn't know what he was going to use it for. Ease. I want you to know that I didn't understand what I was helping with." Ease. "I know," she wrote. "Calloway told me. You called him." Ease. 5 days later. That's not fast enough. She sat with that. Ease. She wrote, "No, it wasn't." Then, after a moment, "But you called." Ease. "That matters too." He looked down at the table. He wrote, "Ease, I wasn't a good employer to you, not just because of this. Ease, I treated you like you were less than. Every day. Ease. And I don't think I even noticed I was doing it." He paused. Ease, pen still in hand, and then added below it, "That's almost worse." Ease. "Isn't it?" She looked at what he'd written. She thought about 11 months of managed invisibility. Ease. She thought about the laminated card and the post-it notes and the loud, ease, exaggerated speech. She thought about all the ways she'd bent herself into a shape that was easier for him to deal with. Ease. She wrote, "Yes, it's almost worse." He nodded. He looked like he was going to write something more and then didn't. Ease. She watched him sit with the honesty of what she'd said. Ease. And she gave him the space to do it, because that too was something she'd learned, that when someone is finally willing to hear a real answer, he's rushing past it, diminishes the whole exchange. Then she wrote, "Ease. You had a conversation with a man you didn't know. Ease. And you answered questions you didn't understand the purpose of. Ease. And when you figured out what you'd done, you made a call. Ease. That call helped build a case. I'm not telling you we're even. Ease. But I'm telling you that matters." He read it twice. Ease. He wrote, "What are you doing now?" "This place." He gestured at the room. Ease. She wrote, "Working with deaf youth, helping them learn to navigate employment." Ease. "Stop making themselves small for people who should be meeting them where they are." Ease. He read that, and she watched his face move through something, the recognition of the specific weight of those words. He's directed at him, the echo of his own behavior in them. Ease. He wrote, "I see." "Good," she wrote. And she meant it both ways. "Good that you see." Ease. "And good that this conversation happened. And good that you came." Ease. Layered into 2 letters, the way everything meaningful was always compressed when you communicated in writing. Ease. He stood up to leave. At the door, he turned back and wrote one more thing on the notepad. Ease. Tearing off the sheet and holding it out to her. For what it's worth, you were the best employee I had. Ease. I just didn't know how to say it. She took the paper. Ease. She looked at it. She thought about 11 months of being underestimated and overlooked by a man who had apparently, at some level she never saw, recognized her value and lacked the language to express it. She wrote on the remaining page, work on that, the saying it part. Other people need to hear it. He left. She sat in the room for a moment after he was gone, holding the torn sheet of notepaper, thinking about the specific strangeness of a world that delivered its reckonings out of order and at unexpected times. And then she put the paper in her bag and went back to work. The trial of Warren Aldis opened on a February morning that was cold enough to make the Arizona sky a particular hard shade of blue that Emily had always associated with serious occasions. She dressed carefully, not because she thought clothing determined outcomes, but because preparation was a form of respect for the process, for herself, for the 40 lives that had been at risk on a July afternoon when 5 men with guns spread a map across the hood of a truck. Bear drove her to the courthouse. They made the 2-hour trip largely in companionable quiet he'd learned over the months that she didn't need conversation to fill space. And she'd come to understand that this was true of him as well. That the silences between them were not empty, but simply unspoken. Which was a different thing entirely. Halfway there, he reached over and put his phone on the console between them. Screen up. He typed, how are you? She picked it up and typed, he's ready. Actually ready this time, not just committed. He read it at the next stop. Typed, different feeling. Committed is when you're still a little scared, but you're going anyway. She typed. Ready is when the scared part has been replaced by something cleaner. He looked at that and drove in silence for a moment, and then typed one-handed, which she'd only seen him do in situations of some feeling. That's a good way to put it. The courtroom was large and formal in the way that institutions announce themselves through architecture, and Emily absorbed it the way she absorbed every room, the positioning of people. The quality of attention in their bodies, what their faces said when they thought no one was watching. Aldis sat at the defense table in a suit that communicated money without screaming it. He had the composed, slightly remote expression of a man who had been well prepared by expensive lawyers and who believed, at some level, that the room's machinery would ultimately resolve in his favor. He looked at her once when she entered. Just once a quick, assessing glance that he pulled back immediately and redirected at his attorney. But she caught it and she read it, and what she read in it was not the contempt she'd expected. It was something more unsettling. It was recalculation. She sat in the gallery beside Carla and Bear and waited. She was called to the stand on the second day. The prosecutor was a compact, precise woman named Diane Reeves, who had the quality of stillness that Emily associated with people who were very good at their jobs, nothing wasted, everything intentional. She had an interpreter standing to Emily's left, a certified court interpreter named Paul, who Emily had met twice beforehand to establish their working rhythm. And the judge had already instructed the courtroom on the protocol. Questions would be asked in English. Emily would respond in ASL. Paul would voice her responses in real time. Emily had been in that chair in her mind 100 times over the past 8 months. She had rehearsed not the words, but the steadiness, the quality of being fully present. Fully honest, unshaken by the architecture of the room or the weight of the defense table's attention. It began with the facts, the route, the date, the time. What Emily had observed at the Kellner warehouse. Emily answered in ASL. Clean and specific, and listened with her eyes as Paul voiced her responses. Checking his accuracy in real time. It was good she had made sure he was good. When Reeves reached the diagram, the map on the hood of the truck, the building layout, the corroborating identification she'd made in Calloway's office, Emily signed her responses with the same precision she'd signed everything else. And she watched Reeves build the structure around it. The way a skilled architect works, each piece placed where it would hold the next piece. Then the defense stood up. Aldis's lead attorney was a man named Carver who had the specific cultivated pleasantness of someone who had learned that juries trusted approachable people. Ease. And who used that pleasantness the way some people used a scalpel, with precision and without warmth. Ease. He began with her distance from the warehouse, 40 yards. Ease, she had said. He produced a diagram, not the Kellner diagram, but a scale rendering of the site, and pointed at the measurement. Ease, he asked pleasantly whether she was confident in her judgment of 40 yards. Ease, she signed. Yes, whether the lighting had been ideal. Ease, she signed. It was 4:30 in the afternoon in Arizona in July. Ease. The lighting was direct and strong. He moved to the diagram identification. Ease. She had identified the layout on the second attempt. Ease, he noted. Did the first attempt produce a different result? Ease. She signed. On the first pass, I was deliberately looking at all three layouts neutrally. Ease. On the second pass, I had calibrated my visual memory against the layouts. Ease. I identified the correct one. Carver asked pleasantly. Ease. Whether she was familiar with the concept of confirmation bias. Ease. She looked at him. Paul voiced her response. Yes, I'm also familiar with the concept of a man who spread a map of a building across a truck hood while his associates loaded weapons. Ease. I know which concept is more relevant to this case. Ease. The gallery shifted. The judge said something. She caught the word witness and the shape of a caution. Ease. She kept her eyes on Carver. He moved on. He asked about the phrase she had lip-read from Dennis Farrow. Ease. Wrong choice. He asked still pleasantly whether she was certain. Ease. Given that she had been on a public street, that those words had been directed at her specifically. Ease. She signed. He stopped his truck alongside me on a residential street where I was the only person present. Ease. Made direct eye contact and spoke. I am certain. Carver asked whether it was possible the words meant something other than what she had interpreted. Ease. She signed. What other interpretation would you like to offer? Ease. The gallery shifted again. Carver looked at his notes. Ease. He spent another 40 minutes on the cross-examination. Ease. And Emily answered every question with the same quality of stillness she'd walked in with, not combative. Ease, not performing, just relentlessly present and accurate. Ease. She had nothing to hide. She had seen what she had seen. Ease. She had run and testified and shown up, and 8 months of preparation had burned away everything except the truth of the afternoon of July 17th. Ease, which was a thing she carried in her body and didn't need to construct. Ease. When Carver finally said no further questions, Emily looked at Reeves. Ease, who gave her a small, controlled nod. She stepped down. Ease. She passed the defense table on the way back to her seat. Ease. She did not look at Aldous. She had decided this in advance, not out of avoidance, but out of priority. Ease. He wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the testimony she'd given. Ease. The record she'd put into the room, the contribution she'd made to a structure of truth that was going to outlast her presence in that courtroom. Ease. She sat down beside Carla, who signed perfect. One word. Ease. Carla didn't embellish when embellishment would dilute. Ease. Bear, on her other side, said nothing, but he put his fist briefly on the armrest between them. Ease. The same gesture the red-bearded man had made at that first big meeting. Ease. And she put hers next to it, and that was enough. The verdict came on the fourth day of deliberations. Ease, which Calloway had told her in advance, was a good sign, not so fast as to suggest the jury hadn't engaged. Ease, not so slow as to indicate the evidence was insufficient. Ease. Reeves called her personally, through the text relay system Bear had set up months ago. Ease at 2:15 in the afternoon. Guilty, on all principal counts. Ease. She was standing in the Kingman office when the message came through. Ease. Sitting across from Jordan, who had been working through a mock job interview scenario with the specific, focused intensity that had emerged in her over the past months, as she'd stopped performing smallness and started occupying her actual size. Ease. Emily read the message and then set the phone face down on the table. Ease. Jordan was watching her face. Signed, good news. Emily thought about how to answer that. Ease. She thought about July 17th, and the dirt path, and the run, and the warehouse, and the 5 armed men, and the chain of events that led from that moment to this one, through testimony and fear and gratitude and the slow, grinding work of a legal case, and 43 young people in a 4-county program, and a chair by the window, and a name sign, and a patch she kept in the drawer of her desk at home, because putting it anywhere more visible felt like something she hadn't quite earned permission for yet. Please, she signed. Very good news. Jordan signed. The trial? Please. Emily nodded. Jordan looked at her for a moment, then signed. Please, with the blunt directness of someone who had been learning to say the true thing. Please, are you okay, like actually? Emily took a breath. She signed. Please, I'm going to be. I think I already mostly am, but it's a lot. Please, when something that took up that much space is finally over, please, the space doesn't just disappear. You have to figure out what goes in it. Please. Jordan thought about that with the seriousness of a person for whom it was not just an abstract observation. Please. Then signed. What are you going to put in it? Emily looked at the room around her, the office. Please. The program, the 43 files. Jordan across the table practicing for a job interview with the posture of someone who was done being small. Please. She thought about Bear's ASL. Please. Still improving. Please. Getting more precise every week. Please. Offered without announcement or expectation of credit. Please. She thought about Nora at the kitchen table with a flashlight and library books when Emily was 4. Please. She thought about 2 words on a man's lips on a residential sidewalk that had frightened her badly enough to make her angry. Please. And how that anger had carried her through months of showing up. Please. She signed this. I'm going to keep putting this in it. Please. Jordan nodded, then signed with the small smile of someone who is beginning to understand that strength is not a feature you're born with, but a practice you build. Please. Good. We need you here. 3 months after the verdict. Please. Emily stood in front of a room of 40 people at a community center in Flagstaff and spoke. Please. Not signed, spoke. She did both, signing and speaking simultaneously in the way she sometimes chose to when she wanted the words to be fully present in both worlds. Please. When she wanted no distance between what she was communicating and how it landed. Please. Her voice was clear and practiced and entirely her own. Please. The voice that had always surprised people who expected something different and that she had stopped apologizing for years ago. Please. She talked about July 17th. She talked about the dirt path and the warehoused guns and the 2-mile run in work shoes and the decision that had not felt like a decision so much as an inevitability. Please. She talked about what came after the testimony, the fear, please, the 8 months of waiting, the verdict. She talked about Jordan and the mock interview and the posture of someone who was done being small. Please. She talked about what it meant to be deaf in a world that was designed around hearing, not as a complaint, please, not as a bid for pity, but as a straightforward description of a reality she had been navigating since birth and had come to understand better than almost anyone in the room. Please. She talked about what you learned when you couldn't rely on sound, the reading of faces. Please. The interpretation of silences, the attention to the things underneath the words. Please. She talked about how those skills had been the exact right equipment for a Tuesday afternoon in July when 5 men with weapons were planning something that only she had witnessed. Please, she said. People have asked me if I think my deafness made me brave. Please, I want to be specific about this. My deafness didn't make me brave. Please, it made me observant. It made me pay attention in ways that people who can hear sometimes don't bother to. Please. And on one particular afternoon, that attention put me in the position where the only honest option was to run. Please. She paused. The running, that was a choice. But it was the easiest choice I've ever made. Please. Because the alternative was living with myself afterward. Please. And I've always been the most important person I have to answer to. Please. The room was quiet in the particular way rooms get quiet when something true has been said into them. Please. She looked out at the faces, and she thought about visibility, about the 20 years she'd spent making herself smaller and easier and less inconvenient. Please. And about how that shrinking had protected her from exactly nothing, while costing her things she was still in the process of calculating. Please. She thought about Jordan's face when she'd said, "We need you here." Please. She thought about Harriet's name sign, the motion of it. Please. The running forward quality of the shape. She signed and spoke the last thing. Please. I spent a long time being the person people looked past before they saw me. Please. I am done with that. Not because I'm famous for something that happened in July. Please. Not because 500 people came to a parking lot one Tuesday morning. Please. Because I decided I was done with it. And you get to do the same. Please. You get to decide. Nobody gives you that permission. Please. You just take it. The call from Bear came that evening. Please. When she was on the bus back to Red Hollow. He couldn't call her, please. So it came as a text, which was the language their friendship had been built in, and which she had come to find more expressive than most people found speech. Please, he texted, heard it went well today. Harriet called. Please, she texted back, it did. How do you feel? She thought about the question. Please. She looked out the bus window at the Arizona dark coming in over the desert. Please, the flat land and the sky that went on further than you could track. Please. She thought about July 17th and the person she'd been on that path and the person she was on this bus and the enormous, irreversible distance between them. She texted, like someone who ran a long way and arrived somewhere real. Please. He read it. She could tell when Bear was reading something that mattered to him because there was a longer pause before the three dots appeared. Please. When they came, that's the best description I've heard yet. Bear, she texted, yeah. Thank you for the door. All the doors. Please. The Monday meeting and the meeting with Calloway and the chair by your kitchen window. Please. A pause, then you walk through them. You built them. Please. Another pause longer. Then that's what you do for family. Please. She held the phone in her lap and looked out the window and let that land fully. Please. The way Carla had told her to let things land, without calculating the return on it, please. Without measuring how much of it she deserved against some internal ledger she'd been keeping since childhood. Please. She let it be true without conditions. The bus moved through the dark. Please. Red Hollow was 40 minutes away. Nora was in the kitchen. Please. Jordan had a real interview next Thursday with a logistics company whose HR director had called Harriet directly after learning about the program. 43 files, one start date that had already become something larger than a start. Emily Carter looked at the Arizona night and thought about what it meant to be heard, really heard, not in the audiological sense she'd never had access to, but in the deeper sense, the one that had nothing to do with sound. The sense of being understood before you explained yourself. Of being seen before you made yourself visible. Of being valued without first making yourself convenient. She had spent 20 years in a world that was not built for her and had learned, in spite of it, or perhaps because of it, the exact skills required to be indispensable on a Tuesday afternoon in July when everything depended on one person paying attention and refusing to look away. She had run 2 miles. She had held up a piece of paper with shaking hands. She had told the truth in every room that asked for it, and in a few rooms that hadn't expected her to show up at all. She had let people in slowly. Honestly. At the pace of a person who had earned her caution and was choosing, with full knowledge of what she was doing, to set it down. The bus pulled into Red Hollow. Emily stood up, picked up her bag, and walked to the door. The desert air hit her when the doors opened, cool now, with the particular clarity that Arizona nights had, the kind of air that felt like it had been washed and was being offered to you directly, without mediation. She stepped down onto the familiar pavement of a town that had known her all her life and had only recently begun to understand what it was looking at. She walked home, same streets, same houses, same 4-block route she'd walked 1,000 times. But nothing about it was the same as it had been on the morning of July 17th. And nothing about her was the same either, and she did not mourn the before version of herself. She understood it. She was grateful for what it had taught her. She had carried it this far and set it down where it needed to stay. She was 20 years old. She had a job that mattered and a community that had chosen her, and a grandmother with arthritic hands who had learned ASL from library books by flashlight. She had a name sign that moved like running. She had a patch in a drawer at home that she was going to take out and put somewhere visible. She decided, starting tonight. She walked into her grandmother's kitchen, and Nora looked up from the table and signed, Simply, how was it? Emily set her bag down. She sat in her chair. She looked at her grandmother, the woman who had made her, who had refused to let the world convince either of them that Emily's silence was a limitation rather than a different kind of language. She signed. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. Nora nodded. She pushed a cup of tea across the table. She signed. Good. Now eat something. You look like you ran 2 miles. Emily laughed. For real, fully. Without reservation. The laugh of a person who has come through something hard and arrived somewhere worth arriving. Ease. Who can find the specific joy in a grandmother's particular joke at the end of a particular day. Ease. She laughed and Nora smiled, and the kitchen held them both the way it always had. Ease. Unchanged and permanent and entirely sufficient. The deaf girl who had run toward danger when everyone else would have walked away had not become someone else. Ease she had become. Ease finally and completely. Ease herself in the world. Ease, which had spent 20 years looking past her, had learned at last to look. Ease. She had never needed it to hear her. She had only ever needed it to pay attention. Ease. And on one ordinary Tuesday in July, in a town too small for most maps, she had made certain that it did.